Okay, welcome to my latest video, which is titled Arguments for Jesus' Deity. So, Christians claim that Jesus is God. How can we know that that claim is true? This comes after the videos that defended the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead in two ways. The first did so from history, and the second did so from the conduct of Christians. It seemed natural to pivot from that argument to arguments for his deity, so here we go. Before we begin, note that I will be assuming that the New Testament is historically reliable. In other words, it is generally true as a historical document and is not fraudulent or mistaken on any major topics. If one disagrees with this, then I encourage them to pause this video and go back to my earlier video where I defend this. Ideally, one would watch the videos in order as they build on each other. If one does believe that the New Testament is historically reliable, then the purpose of this video is to present evidence for the deity of Jesus of Nazareth. By deity, I am referring to a monotheistic deity, capital G, God, not a polytheistic deity like Krishna or Baal. But from now on, to say that Jesus is God means that he is the all-powerful, sovereign creator of the universe. Before we begin, let me establish an important rule, which is defended in more detail in my video titled Methodology. I cannot prove that Jesus is God beyond any doubt, only beyond a reasonable doubt. I say this because many seem to think otherwise. As it is, if I only need to provide reasonable and not absolute proof for my conclusion, then it follows that any objection made to it must not only be possible, but reasonable. So, finding a theoretical loophole in my argument that is technically possible is not enough. One must give actual evidence for their position, just as they would demand of mine. I will be giving a total of 7 arguments for Jesus' deity. The main content of 5 of these arguments are from prior videos in my series Defending the Bible, and I will merely be applying that content here in a relevant manner. 2 of these arguments are indirect, meaning that they evidence his deity effectively, not directly. Then I will give 2 new arguments for his deity, where I will be presenting content not previously covered in this series. These are the liar, lunatic, or legend trilemma, presented by C.S. Lewis, and a variation of that concerning his miracles. If one wishes to hear the content required to make my points defended in more detail, then I recommend going back to their respective video series and watching those. Starting with our first argument, I indirectly show the deity of Christ in the methodology video, where I established the methods by which we engage in the debate surrounding the Bible's truth. I started this video off by saying that nobody is neutral and that everybody worships something. In this way, the Christian and the non-Christian are alike. The primary difference is not whether they worship, but what they worship. I represented this fact with a diagram seen here that has a figurative throne in a person's heart. Something must reign from that throne. It cannot be left empty. And Jesus, through his numerous claims to deity that are listed in my Did Jesus Claim to Be God series, claimed that he should be sitting on that throne. He gets to call the shots, not us. So either Christ sits on the throne of one's heart, or something else does. Now this shows Christ's deity not directly, but effectively, because many objections to the Christian faith target its spiritual or religious nature, as if the objector does not worship anything. These objections sound something like, I don't believe in anything spiritual. Matter is all there is. Or, I like my life as is, without religion. But the objector is spiritual. They are religious just like the Christian. If this can be shown, then it becomes an open competition for who they should worship, instead of being rejected outright. Christ is now vying for control with his main competitor in today's society, self. In other words, the objector is no longer the manager that decides if Jesus is qualified for the job. Both them and Jesus are fellow applicants to the same position, the king of one's heart. It is a competition of deities. If the skeptic begins to see the debate that way, it becomes quite obvious who should be sitting on that throne. To see this, let's take a look at what the applicants wrote on their resumes. On the one hand, we have Christ, who claims to be the eternal God whose character forms the basis for holy conduct. We, on the other hand, twist our morals around our selfish desires. Jesus died on the cross for his enemies. We, on the other hand, curse people when they cut us off in traffic. Jesus performed miracles that are well attested to by eyewitness accounts and even by his enemies, demonstrating his divine power and ability to reign with sovereignty. We, on the other hand, die when our heart stops for more than a few minutes. Jesus claims to be the image of the invisible God. We, on the other hand, curse those who are made in God's image. So it becomes quite clear who should be God, and this is done mostly by addressing the spiritual motives going into the debate. One might say, but don't you have to presuppose the Bible's truth to say these things of Jesus? Yes, I do. What I am saying, though, is that many skeptics are skeptical of the Bible in large part because of its religious nature, not because they can object to the evidence. So if one can address the spiritual motive, the debate is effectively won. Jesus is crowned king. One might say, but couldn't a Muslim make this argument for Allah? Yes, they could, but I am talking about what effectively convinces someone in our current culture. Because most people in our culture are already familiar with the Bible and with Jesus, it is therefore what they run to, not Islam, when their own sufficiency is questioned. We also showed in an indirect way that Jesus is God through my video titled, Everyone Knows They Need a Savior, the Self-Evident Nature of the Gospel. This video addressed the question, how do I fix my sin? Which referred to any moral shortcoming, in the objector's view, not the Bible's. I said that the only reasonable solution to sin involves a substitute bearing the consequences of that sin in our place, whose attributes, in order to do so, must closely resemble those of Jesus Christ. In fact, Christianity is the only religion to even come close to offering a real solution for sin. All the others, and all the solutions man has come up with, do not do this. So, if there is a hole in our hearts, then Christ is the custom-designed key made to fill it, unlocking as substitute the potential of a relationship with God that would otherwise be marred by our sin. So, how does this show, effectively speaking, that Jesus is God? There are three options. Firstly, it is possible that a person will turn to him purely on the basis that he is their only logical hope for sin, and he will become God for them in that way. Secondly, it is possible that a person will investigate the historical evidence for the Bible, asking themselves, I want this to be true because Jesus is my only hope, but I don't know if it is actually true. And they find that the evidence does in fact point to Jesus' deity, and they will believe that way. Or thirdly, if they already accept Jesus' existence and most of his teachings, but deny that he is God in the biblical sense, such as the Mormon, they might change their view based on the fact that theologically speaking, Jesus must be God in order to be their substitute for sin. So, there are many ways in which this argument can show Jesus' deity effectively, not directly. Again, this is not direct. It is only saying that Jesus must be God for the sinner, not in actuality. We also show Jesus' deity in more direct ways. Starting with the historical reliability of the gospel accounts, we established that they are historically reliable documents. And the Christian faith is unique in that most of its spiritual claims are embedded in its historical claims. In other words, we cannot separate the historical events with their spiritual or from their spiritual implications. This means that we can examine its spiritual claims, such as that Jesus is God, through a historical lens. For example, if Jesus rose from the dead historically, then he is God spiritually. Or, if Jesus really did heal people and raise them from the dead like the gospel accounts say he did, if that is historically likely, then it is also likely that he is the God he claims to be. So, we can decide who he was through history. And if one wishes to see biblical evidence that Jesus claimed to be God, then I recommend watching my video series on the topic. The historical event that would most evidence his deity, if true, is the resurrection. So I defended this event in particular from history using Gary Habermas's and Michael Lacona's minimal facts approach. In a nutshell, this sought the best explanation for 4 facts surrounding the end of Jesus' ministry that even secular scholars accept. And they said that the best explanation of these facts is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Since the facts required to do so are agreed upon even by secular scholars, then the Bible is not needed for this argument. Now, being raised from the dead does not prove that one is God. In fact, in the Bible, there are other people besides Jesus that rose from the dead who definitely are not God. But if we add to his resurrection the fact that he claims many times to be God, which is defended in my video series on the topic, then we can reasonably conclude that his claim was true. In other words, the resurrection proved his claim about himself. Apart from his claim, the resurrection would not be proof of his deity. Of course, this assumes that the gospel accounts that contain his claims are historically reliable. We also argued for the resurrection of Christ from Christian conduct, meaning that regeneration, referring to the process by which God inwardly renews a person by giving them a new heart, is the only reasonable explanation of 4 traits we see in the lives of Christians. So I took a minimal facts approach of my own, but instead of looking at historical evidence, we looked at evidence that many people can see simply by looking at the life of a devout Christian. The Christian has been regenerated by something based on how they live. And Christ's deity is the only reasonable explanation for regeneration. It would be adding unnecessary steps if one said that they gave their lives to Christ but were regenerated by something else. And the power to regenerate suggests his deity. In other words, if Jesus is able to raise people from the dead, spiritually speaking, unto newness of life, then that suggests divine power. So that concludes 5 arguments for Jesus' deity whose main content was given elsewhere in the series. These were as follows. Firstly, Jesus is God because he is a better candidate to be God than us, something that was implied in my methodology video. Secondly, Jesus is God because only he can save us from our sin, something that was implied in the video titled, Everyone Knows They Need a Savior, the Self-Evident Nature of the Gospel. Thirdly, Jesus is God from a historical perspective because of the truthfulness of the gospel accounts, which make this claim through the historical events that they record. Fourthly and fifthly, Jesus is God because his resurrection is the only reasonable explanation of the events surrounding the end of his ministry and of the traits we see in a devout Christian's life. Again, I cannot show his deity beyond any doubt, only beyond a reasonable doubt. It is up to you, if you haven't already, to take the leap of faith and believe in someone that you cannot hope to fully understand. Now I will introduce a new argument, which is C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, or legend trilemma. In a nutshell, it says that Jesus existed and claimed to be God, a claim that could not have been false based on his moral conduct and intelligence. The first step in this argument is to show that Jesus actually existed. Jesus' crucifixion alone is mentioned by at least 5 secular, non-Christian sources. This includes Josephus, the Jewish historian, Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, Mara bar Serapion, who indirectly referenced Jesus' crucifixion in a letter to his son from prison, and we have the Jewish Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish tradition compiled in the 3rd to 6th centuries. And the Talmud is especially hostile toward Christianity, so they, of all people, would be the first to say that Jesus did not exist if in fact he didn't exist. In addition, the main events of Jesus' life are recorded by non-Christian sources, including the basics of his ministry and his ability to convince others that he was God. This is not to say that the 4 eyewitness gospel accounts of his ministry are to be disregarded simply because they are written by Christian sources. From a historical point of view, they are very high-quality accounts, and if we use the same standard to judge their reliability that we used on other historical documents, we would accept Jesus' existence without a doubt. This is defended in my video titled, The Historical Reliability of the Gospel Accounts. Because Jesus' existence is widely attested to by both Christian and non-Christian sources, it is almost universally accepted among New Testament scholars, Christian and non-Christian. Saying that Jesus is merely a legend is not something that is heard often in educated circles, as it contradicts much historical evidence for his existence. So we know beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus existed. Did he claim to be God? He did, especially if one accepts the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. You can hear this and Jesus' claims to be God defended in the respective video series on these topics. But to give an example, Jesus told a Jewish audience that he and the Father, referring to God, are one. And Jesus, if he was speaking figuratively and not literally, had every opportunity to clarify what he said because the Jews reportedly picked up stones to stone him for blasphemy. Similarly, Jesus claimed many times to be the Messiah, which he knew the Old Testament equated with capital G God in passages like Isaiah 9. Likewise, he demanded that we love him more than our father and mother, which he said elsewhere was only to be less important than love for God. He even quoted the Psalms to the Pharisees in his triumphal entry to justify the children's worship of him, applying a verse that was meant for God to himself. So Jesus claimed to be God in various ways. In my video on the topic, I go through about 63 direct and indirect claims to his deity, as well as what the rest of the Bible says on the topic. I defended it in such detail because the primary way in which people deny his deity today is by saying that he never claimed it. Because, as we will see, once he does claim it, his deity is very difficult to avoid. Assuming that he did claim it, there are two ways that claim could be false. One is that he knew it was false, making him a liar. And I have a picture of a devil here. I am not exaggerating in saying that Jesus would be a devil if he were lying. Why? Because his claim to deity was absolutely central to his ministry. This is seen by the sheer number of times he made the claim, at least 63 if my video series is correct, and that was measured only over a short period of his life that the gospel accounts actually record. So it was likely much more than that. But that isn't even including the indirect evidence for this claim that I give through the rest of the New Testament writings. And we know that theologically speaking, he must be God for at least 9 reasons in order to save people from sin, which was his primary mission. For a detailed defense of those reasons, see the last part of the video series on his deity. So, his deity was central to his ministry, so this is not a minor faux pas, an accidental oopsie-doopsie if he claimed to be God and was lying. Furthermore, several of his apostles, as well as other early Christians, died for the claim that he was God, and Jesus knew they would die. He predicted it several times. If Jesus knew that his claim to deity was false, then he would have been willfully deceiving them to their death. These martyrs would have died for a false cause, placing Jesus on the level of some famous cult leaders. Even if we manage to separate out his false claim from the rest of him, the objector must judge Jesus by his own words. Jesus himself affirmed the truth of the Old Testament many times, the same Old Testament that would condemn him as a blasphemer worthy of death if his claim to deity was false. That same Old Testament would also label him as a false prophet and as an idolater, since he would be stealing worship from the one true God. So, if Jesus' claim was false, then he would be a blaspheming, idolatrous false prophet worthy of death by his own logic, not ours. And this is especially the case if he knew his claim was false. So, Jesus does not give the objector the luxury of treating him with neutrality. Either he is the God he claims to be, or he was a liar and a fraud, founding his ministry on a false concept, willfully deceiving people to their death, and damning himself by his own logic. But there is one other option here. Maybe Jesus' claim was wrong, but he didn't know it. So he sincerely thought he was God when he wasn't. C.S. Lewis says that the level of insanity required to do this would be like a man thinking he is a poached egg. And I agree with him, given the particular type of God he was claiming to be. I explain this more in the first part of my video series on Jesus' claims to deity, but suffice it to say that there was a huge gap between the God that both he and the Israelite culture believed in and man. That is, the God of the Old Testament's sovereignty, power, majesty, and uncreated nature put him in a completely separate category from mankind. Imagine an ant claiming to its fellow ants that it was actually a human just in ant form, and had the intelligence, power, and longevity of a human, and how crazy that would be if that claim were false. And the gap between God and man in the Old Testament that Jesus was referring to is much greater than the gap between an ant and a man, or the gap between a poached egg and a man. Specifically, Jesus claimed to be the all-powerful God of the Old Testament, which means that he was literally the creator of the audience that he told that to. He is saying, in effect, I created you, you were there for my glory, I am the rightful object of your worship and no other. To not worship me is punishable by death. Jesus would be quite deluded if he were sincerely mistaken about this. And, as explained earlier, By Jesus' own logic that he used from the Old Testament, he would be condemned as an idolatrous, blaspheming false prophet, worthy of death by the very Old Testament he used to support his claim, if his claim was false. Starting with the first option, was Jesus a liar? No. The first problem with this accusation is that he lacked a plausible motive for lying, because it was his very claim that he was God that got him crucified. The Jews thought he was guilty of blasphemy. People die every day for causes that they think are true, but nobody dies for a cause that they know is false. Jesus had every chance to recant his claim in order to save his own life. The fact that he didn't is strong evidence that he believed it. But let's address some specific motives. Was Jesus vying for popularity? Was he trying to paint himself as the long-lost Messiah of the Israelite people by claiming he was God? Yes, he was trying to do this, but his attributes did not match Jewish expectations, and he was largely rejected. Surely he would have painted himself in a manner that was more consistent with Jewish expectation. Was Jesus trying to get rich? No, Jesus said he was homeless, that foxes have holes and that birds of the air have nests, but that the Son of Man, referring to himself, has no place to lay his head. But what about women? They say that people will do anything for love, right? Well, Jesus was single, and there is no evidence to suggest that he had relations outside of marriage, or any relations for that matter. So, no plausible motive exists, and no ulterior motive would explain his willingness to die for supposed blasphemy. The second problem is that lying would be inconsistent with his teachings to not lie. Jesus, if he were lying, would be guilty of breaking his own commandments. This is not a bulletproof argument, but most frauds would not do this. They would alter their moral teachings to make room for their own debased behavior, but Jesus did not compromise on God's law one bit. Thirdly, Jesus' conduct perfectly displayed the traits of humility and compassion. If Jesus were lying, presumably for his own benefit, he would not have been humble enough to die on a cross in the place of his enemies. And lying to his audience about his deity, a claim that, if false, would have gotten some of his listeners martyred, would not be compassionate. But Jesus modeled compassion perfectly, showing tender kindness even to the rejects of society. So, lying was inconsistent with both Jesus' words and his actions, both of which reveal the heart. On the same note, the fourth and last problem for this accusation is that the objector has no other examples of Jesus lying, meaning that their accusation is speculative and not based on evidence. In fact, there is a large amount of evidence to the contrary, so Jesus was not a liar. Well, what about the other option? Was Jesus a lunatic? Once again, the objector has no other examples of Jesus being deluded. Any accusation would be purely speculative, and there is strong evidence to the contrary. Jesus demonstrated his intelligence through his masterful use of Scripture. For example, when the Pharisees, who were trying to trap Jesus in his words, asked him in Mark 11:28, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" And they were likely referring to cleansing the temple or possibly his miracles. Now this was a loaded question. The Pharisees likely knew that Jesus thought he was from God, but they wanted to confirm it so that they might have a basis for accusing him. Unexpectedly, Jesus answered their question with a question, asking them, "Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" Now John the Baptist said that Jesus was the Messiah, and the Pharisees rejected him. So this was a loaded question for the Pharisees, and they knew it. In their discussion amongst themselves, they said, "If we say, 'from heaven,' then Jesus would answer, 'Why then did you not believe him?' In other words, if John the Baptist claimed that Jesus was the Messiah and his authority was from heaven, then they should believe that Jesus was the Messiah too. But they rejected both. But if they answered what they really thought and said, 'from men,' then the people who loved John the Baptist would stone them. Being stuck between a rock and a hard place, they told Jesus, 'We don't know.' And Jesus answered, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.' So Jesus answered their question with a question that exposed their hypocritical motives. He wasted no truth on them. He effectively said, "If you Pharisees aren't even willing to acknowledge the truth when it came through John the Baptist, then why should I waste my time telling you by what authority I do my signs?" And I think for Jesus to come up with this on the fly is pretty impressive. And he did this more than once so that the Pharisees were unable to catch him in anything he said. To say that this same person was so stupid and deluded that he didn't know that he wasn't God is ridiculous. Adding to the difficulties for this accusation is the fact that Jesus knew his Old Testament extremely well. He demonstrated masterful use of the Old Testament, quoting verses word by word, even using the exact tenses of verbs to make his point. And they didn't have Bibles in front of them in those days. This was all based on memory. So when he claimed to be the Old Testament Messiah, or when he quoted Old Testament verses about himself that were written exclusively for God, he knew exactly what he was saying. To say that Jesus was unaware of the significance of his claims is ridiculous. It completely contradicts what we read about him. He knew exactly what he was saying, which is why the Jews killed him. So there are 4 ways for Jesus to not be God. He did not exist, he did not claim to be God, or he did claim it and he was a liar or a lunatic. None of these options are supported by evidence, meaning the only remaining option is that he was God. Jesus can't not be God. Allow me to address some objections. There are many ways that people say that Jesus never claimed to be God, and most of them involve saying in some form that the gospel accounts are historically unreliable. For example, popular skeptic Bart Ehrman, in his book How Jesus Became God, posits that Jesus' disciples later added some of his stronger claims to deity to the gospel accounts, and he explains some of the weaker claims in other ways. Others might say that the gospel authors simply picked and chose which parts of Jesus to include in order to make him, quote-unquote, sinless. I indirectly address claims like this in my video series titled The Historical Reliability of the Gospel Accounts. There, I show that if we used the same historical standards to judge the gospel accounts as we would use for other documents, that we would accept their truth without a doubt. And this evidence is rarely addressed by modern skeptics of Christianity, Bart Ehrman's book included. As it is, we should not question the gospel accounts when they say that Jesus claims to be God. Yet others would claim that it is possible for Jesus to have been wrong about his claim without being a liar or a lunatic. They would say, well, everyone tells a white lie or two in their lifetime, or no one gets everything right. Besides, I like his morals and I think he was a good person in spite of being wrong. But this neglects what I said earlier, where I thoroughly defended the seriousness of the falsity of his claim. Being wrong wouldn't have just been an oopsie-doopsie moment for Jesus. It wouldn't have been merely getting the yellow card. It wouldn't have been a minor social faux pas. He was either a complete fraud, placing his willfully false claim to deity at the center of his ministry, or he was a complete lunatic, thinking that he was the almighty, timeless creator God when he was nothing more than a mere man. Yet others would insist that Jesus was a liar or lunatic, in spite of the evidence offered to the contrary. They would point to people like Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a very influential and, for a while, was a successful leader, and yet had severe mental health disorders. Or they would point to psychopaths who exhibit sometimes polite and courteous behavior on the outside, but it is only meant to mask their true motives. So they would say there is still a possibility that he is a liar or a lunatic, despite it not outwardly showing. And this is silly reasoning. Imagine a court case where the defendant is accused of fraudulent activity, and powerful evidence was given by the defense attorney that suggested that he is not guilty. But the prosecuting attorney stands up and says, we can never be sure that he isn't guilty. In fact, I have prosecuted other people who appear to be innocent but weren't. So, Your Honor, let's throw him in prison. Would that one fly? No, for we are obligated to follow the evidence even if there is a chance it is misleading. And would a scientist read a paper in a scientific journal and say, the author of this article presented strong evidence for why their conclusion is true, but technically there is a chance he is wrong. After all, scientists have been wrong before. Would this be an excuse to live one's life as if the article is false, refusing to accept the conclusion in spite of the evidence? No, and yet this is what the objection is doing. It blindly insists on Jesus' guilt. That makes the objection non-falsifiable, meaning it cannot be proven false. That is, no matter how much evidence the Christian offers, the skeptic can say that it only appeared that way. What they fail to recognize is that they too are taking a position on Jesus, which needs to be defended. If they deny this, if they say they are unsure about Jesus, do they live as if Jesus only might be a liar or a lunatic? That is, do they go to church 99% of the time and then 1% of the time abstain to account for the possibility that he was a liar? Or do they pray in 99% of situations, abstaining in the other 1% to account for the possibility that Jesus was a lunatic? No, for the skeptic almost always lives as if their mind is made up, despite being agnostic with their words. So the skeptic makes a truth claim with their objection and makes an even stronger truth claim by the way they live. These truth claims are often masked under the guise of tolerance, inclusiveness, or not being gullible or naive, and are rarely exposed for what they are. But they still need defending. If the objector cannot do that, if all they do is speculate that Jesus might be a liar, then they are morally obligated to accept the evidence for his deity. As it is, this objection uses a double standard. It demands that the Christian present absolute proof for their claim, something I said in the methods section was impossible, and meanwhile accepts its own claims without any evidence. That marks the end of the liar, lunatic, or legend argument. The seventh and last argument for Jesus' deity comes from the miracles he performed. Once again, this only shows his deity when it is combined with the fact that he claims to be God. Otherwise, we could say nothing more than that he is some kind of prophet. To establish that his miracles are historically likely events, note that the gospel accounts alone would be enough to do this. This was discussed earlier when I said that if the same standard is used to judge the gospel accounts as is used for other historical documents, that we would accept what they say without a doubt. This includes Jesus' miracles. The gospel accounts even record that Jesus' enemies admitted that he performed what seemed to be miracles. If this is true, this would be strong evidence, because his enemies had every reason to deny this. Imagine how easy it would have been for them to simply say that the miracle claims are completely made up. But they could not get away from the fact that at the very least, Jesus appeared to perform miracles. For example, the Pharisees observed Jesus driving out a demon. They acknowledged it and attributed it to Satan, which made no sense. The Pharisees also acknowledged that he at least appeared to have raised Lazarus from the dead, which is why they were so afraid of him and were trying to kill Lazarus. And they acknowledged that he at least appeared to have risen from the dead when they paid the soldiers guarding Jesus' tomb to say that his disciples stole the body. Besides the gospel accounts, we have people who weren't necessarily friendly to Christianity admitting the same thing. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus says that Jesus was a worker of amazing deeds. Then we have the first century Jews who never, at least according to historical records, attempted to deny that Jesus appeared to perform miracles. Of course, they attributed it to sorcery, black magic, or even satanic power, but they did not deny the appearance of such things. This is also seen in the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish tradition that was compiled in the 3rd to 6th centuries after Christ, which is noted for its anti-Christian bias. And even that doesn't deny that Jesus did what appeared to be miracles. And here is the punchline. Given what we know about Jesus' character, was he likely to be a con man? Because the only way for him to do what appeared to be miracles and yet not actually perform a miracle is if he duped his audience into thinking something false, much like a magician would appear to pull a rabbit from a hat. But was Jesus the type of person that would do this? Was he a deceiver? No, the evidence indicates strongly to the contrary, as explained earlier. Remember, Jesus used miracles to convince people that he was God, a belief that got some of his disciples killed. If these miracles were merely illusions, then he would have been willfully deceiving them to their deaths. But that is inconsistent with what we know about him. So, the gospel accounts alone are enough to establish Jesus' miracles as historically likely. Add to that the enemy attestation in combination with his moral character. Now, to be fair, most of my information about Jesus' character does come from the gospel accounts, but what other sources do we have that record his actions to a sufficient degree to judge his character? I don't know of any. Besides, I defend their reliability in my video series on the topic. In addition, I talk about the evidence for his most famous miracle, his resurrection from the dead, in detail in my videos on the topic. So in summary, I gave 7 arguments for the deity of Jesus Christ. Remember that by deity, I mean a monotheistic deity, capital G, God, like the all-sovereign, everlasting creator of the Old Testament. The first argument came from my methodology video, saying that Jesus is the most qualified candidate to be God, especially in today's culture where self often sits on the throne of one's heart. I also showed that to properly deal with our sin, we must have a substitute that bears our punishment in our place, with attributes that strongly resemble those of Jesus Christ, his deity included. These first 2 arguments did not present direct evidence for his deity, but did show that accepting his deity follows logically from what we already believe. I then showed 3 direct arguments from past videos, starting with the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. When the gospel accounts are shown to be historically reliable, then we can accept what they have to say about spiritual matters because its spiritual implications are grounded in its historical claims. I then gave a historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus from Gary Habermas's and Michael Lacona's minimal facts approach. I then gave a minimal facts approach of my own from Christian Conduct, arguing that regeneration and the requisite resurrection of Christ is the only way to explain the conduct of devout Christians. I then transitioned to 2 newer arguments, starting with C.S. Lewis's liar, lunatic, or legends trilemma. We know that Jesus existed and that he claimed to be God, and that there was no way for that claim to be false, as he was clearly not a liar or a lunatic. And lastly, I gave the arguments for his deity from the likelihood of his miracles. Keep in mind that his miracles, resurrection included, are not enough to show his deity. We have to add to this Jesus' claims to be God. Then we can reasonably say that the miracles confirmed what he said. In summary, we can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus of Nazareth is God. He is not merely a carpenter and Jewish rabbi. He is much more than that. I encourage you, if you are skeptical of Christianity, to not be afraid to pursue the evidence to a spiritual and supernatural conclusion. In the next video, I will begin to present arguments that defend the reliability of the Old Testament. Of these, a major portion is devoted to Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ, like Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is what the next video is about. I hope to see you there, and thank you for watching.